Welcome to another episode of It Depends podcast. This one I am super excited about. The data build tool, popularly known as DBT, has witnessed a meteoric rise from its inception in 2016 to today. The fact that almost 24,000 companies use the open source and commercial product is by itself impressive. But what's more impressive is the vast and vibrant community that has sprung around DBT. To understand what makes this product so endearing, we have today in our studios Tristan Handy, the co-founder and CEO of DBT Labs. Tristan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. I'm honored you took time to get into DBT's history and product, what makes it tick. So before we get started, would you mind giving us a brief introduction about your career and yourself?
Oh gosh, I've been working with data for a long time, probably starting in high school and part-time jobs where, this was back in the late 90s. You could get paid, a good hourly rate as a college kid or as a high school kid, just being the person in the room who knew Excel. So that's kind of where I started, and then went to Big Four consulting firm at Deloitte Consulting after undergrad, and then found a career in data in startups out of grad school, and I've been bouncing around the startup ecosystem ever since. I've always been on the East Coast, and so I think there were companies that were doing things that were kind of light years ahead from a data perspective, the big tech companies, but a lot of this stuff did not make its way to East Coast startups until the advent of the cloud data warehouse. And so, 2013, Amazon Redshift, and then really, I think Snowflake kind of had its coming out party in like 2017, 2018, and BigQuery. That felt like the first time I had access to data infrastructure that was built for me, and so was very excited to take that set of tools, and I initially built a small analytics consultancy around that. It was called Fishtown Analytics, and we did consulting work for Series A, Series B venture-backed startups. We helped them set up their data infrastructure and run an outsourced analytics practice for them, and did that for about 3.5 years before raising money behind the growth of DBT.
So why was it called Fishtown? Well, I know there's a part of Philadelphia that has is something to do with that.
I lived in Fishtown at the time. Well, to be fair, I lived like 2 blocks from Fishtown. I was in a neighborhood called Northern Liberties, but Northern Liberties Analytics was not a good name.
By the way, DBT, it's all lowercase, right? And it stands for data tool. Why did you pick DBT as a name? Why data build tool? Which actually gets to the point, what was a problem that you faced that led you to start a product called DBT?
Oh, it's a big long journey of discovery on my end. I was thinking for about 6 months about this consulting company that I wanted to start. I was still at my last role at the prior company, but the gears were turning, trying to figure it out. And I was doing some data work at my prior company, and I was with modern set of tools. We were using. I worked at a company called Stitch. They built ELT pipelines. It's a competitor to Fivetran at the time, and so we used Stitch and Redshift and Mode Analytics. And I saw the raw data set. So I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with the ELT paradigm, but it's essentially like we, as an industry, it used to be common to extract data, transform it into something usable, and then load it into the warehouse. And then you would get these like very cleaned data sets loaded into your warehouse. But that was problematic for a whole ton of reasons that maybe aren't that interesting to get into right now. But what this meant was that now pipelines did EL and then T. And so all of the raw source data was just loaded directly into your warehouse, which was, if you were from the old world, that sounded terrible. That sounded messy. Like, why would you want all this crap? But from my perspective, I wanted everything, because that meant that there was no question that somebody could ask me that I couldn't answer. I had all the data. I didn't have to like file a ticket or wait for anybody to like give me something new. And so a lot of data people were in my position, and we were like, great, I have all the data. Now I can just go build reports. And it turns out that if you try to build reports directly on top of source data, that's a freaking miserable experience. The data, you end up doing all of this, like munging around with the data inside the context of your report code, which is terrible. It's not reusable. It's not a good way to do it. And so back then, I would see people write mode reports that were 500 lines of SQL and not good. So I wanted to, I'm not a good software engineer, but I am a bad software engineer, and I understand just enough about software engineering best practices to know that we should be looking to create reusable modular code. And so essentially DBT resulted from my desire to refactor some of this terrible SQL that I saw back in the like 2015, 2016 time horizon. And that was the beginning of this process of seeing much of what data people did as kind of reinventions of things that software people had known for multiple decades already.
So I have a question. I wasn't planning to bring this up, but I'll do it anyway. Okay,
great, let's do it.
Okay, great. So I have spoken, in my capacity as an independent advisor, and before that, when I was with Gartner, I get to speak to a lot of ETL companies that had been around for a long time. So shifting from ETL to ELT is something that, these companies could have done. But when I ask them, like, what is it about DBT, they're perplexed. What they say is that we were already doing for more than a decade very sophisticated data transformation, that to build a command line SQL transformation tool would have taken us half an afternoon. But obviously you did something they didn't. So, and I've asked them, obviously they won't say what did they miss. So let me ask you, what was it about DBT that led to such a rush of people wanting to adopt it? Obviously, there was a dire need that had not been met. So what made DBT so different?
Oh, that is, you asked that in a way that is like very multi-layered, and so it's because I thought of the same thing, right? Like we're not the first people to think about transforming data, and in the early days, so DBT was not originally created with any kind of commercial aspirations. It was created as a tool to accelerate our own consulting work. And when I looked at existing solutions, they felt like they were built for somebody else. A lot of times they felt like they were built for somebody with I remember, I think it was Pentaho. The source code was all in Java, and I think I had to learn Java to do flows into something. I could be remembering this incorrectly. Anyway, I looked at these existing solutions, and I was just like, I do not get it. Like as a user, I wouldn't understand how to use this thing. And so DBT was built by somebody with me, my co-founder Drew, also, like, he wrote all the code, but I was kind of user number 0. And so insofar it was built for somebody whose primary language was SQL, it thought about how to deliver an experience for other people like me that was very seamless, very easy to get up and running with. It felt very natural. And so then it turns out that because products like Amazon Redshift and Mode and Periscope and Looker were also coming out at the same time, that really empowered people like me, people who were great business analysts and spoke SQL in their sleep, that all of a sudden people like me could, at least in small companies, we could do everything on our own without the need for any support from anybody else, or any enterprise vendors. So that was very empowering, and that's kind of, I think, where the community came from. It was like this group of people who had felt very disempowered for a long time, with no real clear answers to how that was ever going to change, and now all of a sudden felt like, holy crap, I can determine my future.
So when you built the tool between you and Drew, so it helped your consulting practice. At what point, and what was the catalyst that you said, wow, we built something that we think the community would want, so let's put it on GitHub, open source it. So what was that moment?
So we had it on GitHub with an Apache 2 license from the very beginning.
I see. Okay.
And the original thinking was, one, like, consulting work is kind of lonely. I don't know what your experiences are like going out on your own, but both of us were kind of working out of our own houses, and our Slack was like very quiet. It was just him and me in the Slack again. And so part of it was just like, I wonder if there are other people in the world who are interested in thinking like we are thinking right now. And the other part of it was, we thought maybe people will find DBT and they'll say, it would be cool to have these folks like do a consulting project for us, which did happen a couple times, but it was not a major source of consulting business. But it really was through our clients that the DBT community developed. We had companies that had small to moderate sized data teams that got to see DBT and then got to love it, and then showed their friends, and then had meetups and this kind of stuff. And we measured it. The DBT has anonymous event tracking inside of the open source product. And so we were able to not know who was using the product, but we knew how many people were using the product. And it was this incredibly consistent, not super fast. It grew at 10% every month for many years, like 5-6 years. And so it was after we'd seen this go on for 3.5 full years that we were like, oh my gosh, this thing is getting bigger than we are able to support with just a couple of engineers paid on consulting revenue.
So you went from the open source, which is DBT Core, and then you created DBT Cloud. When did DBT Cloud come out? And I'm curious, we talked about 24,000 customers. What is the breakdown between open source and your DBT Cloud?
DBT Cloud has officially been out for about 3.5 years now.
Okay.
There was kind of a precursor, very lightweight precursor product that we ran for a couple of years before that. But the DBT Cloud was really launched in January of 2020.
Okay.
And oh geez, what was your other question?
So just
penetration,
breakdown of
open source
customers.
penetration.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've always been very curious about the dynamics here, but what my understanding is that many open source technologies, if you look at their usage, by the commercial vendor behind it, is like in the single digits.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, it's more like 25-ish%.
I see.
So the number is pretty high. I think in terms of like industry comps. Now, that's not we're like never happy with that. We are continuing to invest quite a lot in DBT Cloud, and I can talk about that if you're interested. But I am pretty happy that that it seems like our user base is very open to purchasing, commercial cloud software.
Mm-hmm. So I want to dive into DBT Cloud, but before we go there, one thing that has also, by the way, I'm asking all these questions because these are the questions that are in my head about. So I'm so glad hearing from the horse's mouth, if you don't mind the phrase. So no code, low code is such a big move. It's like, let's get business analysts to collaborate. Why should they have to learn programming of any kind? Not Java and all is one level, Python is next level, but even SQL. So in this rush to do low code, no code, you introduce this SQL based tool. So I'm just curious, how was that taken, and what do you think of low code, no code?
So the most powerful tool that humans have ever invented is language.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is, you track back through our history as a species, and there's this real dividing line that, I don't know, depending on who you're talking to, it happened 70,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago. But it's like, to me, in the 7 to 300,000 years ago range. And you can really track the success of the species very, very differently pre and post, what we would today call, modern language. And the wonderful thing about language is that it is a system that is with a reasonably small set of tools, like very few letters and or sounds, I guess, pre-written, and then really not that many words. You can express kind of an infinite complexity of ideas because it's combinatorial. You can just keep stacking up words together and you get more and more complex thoughts. And code has the same property. Code with a small number of constructs, you can express anything. I mean, that is what it means to be Turing complete. It's like any idea can be expressed in that language if it is Turing complete. And there's not actually a way to take your native language and make it, you imagine like making a GUI, a drag and drop interface to like construct sentences. Like what? It's not clear to me why you want that. Like you just want to be able to speak. And so this is like why software engineers use code, because if you know how to code, then you can express any idea. And it's why DBT followed in these footsteps, because so many ideas from software engineering were the ideas that I felt like were in 2016 missing from data, and still many times are what are still missing from data. For example, it is just incredibly challenging to use source control on GUI produced artifacts. Git is not a tool for software engineers. Git is a tool to make sure that large teams of humans can curate assets together. If you don't have some type of source control mechanism, then you don't have a way to maturely govern some artifact over time when you've got many different people working in it, which is why everyone in data always jokes that their Excel sheet is named like something underscore final, because, you know, there is no source control and everybody just emails it all around. So it's infinitely expressive, and because of the text, it submits very well to version control management tooling. There's a third leg in that stool, which is that it turns out that the biggest advances that we've ever had in AI are all based in natural language processing. Yep. And it turns out that just as a result of this set of technological breakthroughs, these large language models can also write code. They don't fundamentally see it as that different than English or Farsi or whatever. And so now, if you are using code to express your ideas, then all of a sudden, AI can be a huge accelerant. Whereas if you're not, then AI doesn't really help you that much.
Yeah. In fact, listening to you, I'm just starting to think, let's talk about LLMs, but let's hold that for a second, because sure. you cannot have any talk, any presentation without LLM. But I love what you just talked about language, how important language is. In fact, you do an amazing job writing a blog, and I think you talked about languages, if I'm not mistaken, just recently. I tell people, when you write something, that is the only time you leave behind a legacy, you know?
Yes.
That is,
your ideas are the thing that are going to outlast you more than anything else.
Yeah. In fact, one of my favorite lines is from Jean Didion, she was an author who died. I'm sure you know her, but some people may not. So she said, "I write to find out what I'm thinking."
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. So going back to DBT Cloud, how is DBT Cloud different from DBT Core?
All right, let's do the sales pitch. No, just kidding. The DBT Core is, it contains the language constructs that you need in order to architect a DBT DAG, directed acyclic graph. So it contains, Core contains the ability to write a data model. It contains the ability to chain many of those different data models together using DBT's ref statement. And then it contains the ability to connect to a database and execute the generated code against that database. That when you invoke DBT, it loads itself into memory. It reads a bunch of files on disk, which are your data transformations. And then it parses them into generatable SQL code. And then it connects to the database and executes all that code in a multi-threaded fashion. Okay. And then it unloads everything from memory. So that's like one DBT execution. Now, that works pretty well for development. And it also works okay at fairly modest use cases, like a team. But when you start wanting to do more sophisticated things than like your kind of basic level data transformation work. You start needing more than that. And that's when DBT Cloud comes in. So DBT Core has no state whatsoever other than the file system. DBT Cloud is, typical cloud infrastructure software. You can set up and execute schedules. So common need for data transformation products is that you need to run things on a consistent basis to make sure that you can actually have the most recent state reflected in your database. It also has a user interface layer that there's a couple of things there. It has we're going to start showing this soon, so maybe this is going to be the first time. I don't know if I've talked about this publicly before, but we've got a new version of our data catalog product that is in DBT Cloud. It's a classic, in order to make a great web app that has great user experience, you need to make it a cloud-backed product. It provides a very accessible browser-based way to author DBT code with a browser-based IDE. So these are the things that today, and we could talk about alerts and notifications and APIs and all these different things that turn out to be very important to the overall DBT experience. But the short answer is DBT Core is the center. It is the language, and DBT Cloud provides all of the capabilities that you need in order to productionize DBT at scale.
Very nice. When you were talking about how DBT Core doesn't maintain the state and it writes to the disk, that reminded me of MapReduce days, because that's exactly what MapReduce was. Extremely heavy. Every single operation had to write to the disk and read it back into the memory until Spark came out. And Spark said, no, we'll maintain the data frame in memory, so you don't have to write. You have to read once, then you do everything in memory. And of course, if something fails, then we can, recover from that, and then we'll write it to the disk. So that's a parallel that came to my mind.
Totally. Fortunately, DBT is a little different because we're not actually ever taking provenance of the data itself. The data never leaves the underlying data platform. So whether it's Databricks or Snowflake or BigQuery or whatever, but totally agree. Files are a critical part of software engineering because ultimately every computer kind of at base level wants to read and write files, but we build abstractions to make it easier to use.
Yeah, no worries. So a quick question about, we were talking about DBT Cloud, and you mentioned data catalog that caught my attention, because I cover data catalogs quite a bit. I know you introduced semantic layer capability last year. Is data catalog been around for a long time, or is this something that's now coming out?
So my co-founder Drew, back in 2018, hacked together one of the best things that we ever built. We called it DBT Docs. And so when you're using DBT, you're writing all this code, and the fundamental thing that you're doing is you're constructing a DAG. And a DAG is the kind of thing that it's very hard to keep it straight in your brain. You really need to be able to visualize it in order to be able to understand what is going on there. And so Drew created I think he worked on this for 2 weeks. He created a single page web app that allowed you to visualize a DBT DAG. And then we created a very lightweight, I think it's fair to call it a really basic data cataloging experience around it. And it's very widely used. I mean, this is a very basic experience, but it is so useful that I think about 50%, you mentioned there were 24,000 companies using DBT today. I think about 50% of those companies use DBT docs. The problem is that the architecture doesn't, it was like basically a hackathon project that has now gotten into the hands of thousands and thousands of people. And the architecture doesn't make any sense. It's a single page web app. It loads a massive JSON object in the very beginning when you first load it up. And when people's DBT projects get to a certain size, it actually just crashes your browser. And so we have, over the last little while, we've been investing in the infrastructure, and most recently have started to build the actual front-end user experience to bring this to like a real cloud experience, as opposed to some hackathon project from 2018.
Got it. I see. And how is the semantic layer doing? What's the adoption of the semantic layer right now?
So we announced the semantic layer last year at Coalesce, our annual user event. And we talked about how we were going to go into, in about a year, we were going to go into general availability. So this was called our community launch.
Okay.
And what happened a couple months later, we started talking to a company called Transform. Founders Nick, James, and Paul had a very, very similar take on the problem. And their technology was honestly, in many ways, it was ahead of ours. I think there are some ways in which our solution was maybe just a little further along, but in many ways, Transform's technology was ahead of ours. And so I think it was February, we decided to join forces. The Transform team joined DBT Labs, and we have been racing to get their technology incorporated into the DBT semantic layer. And so over the past, I think it's been about 6 weeks as of the time we record this, we have started to do the first releases, and the next, let's say 4 to 8 weeks are going to be really the culmination of all of this integration work that started in like early March. So we're very excited about the semantic layer with what they call metric flow. The Transform folks at an open source project they call metric flow, which does the semantic layer query generation. And so it's really at the heart of the entire semantic layer experience. And now this will enable us to calculate arbitrarily complex metrics and this is the hardest thing, do arbitrarily complex joins across many different tables. And it will create optimized SQL that, based on the query plan, will minimize the execution time required. So
how?
Yeah.
And how does that work? So if I have to take data from 2 different tables and I have to do some complex transformation, how does the metric flow help me do that?
So the DBT semantic layer will allow you to, in your DBT code, define the relationships between different tables. And you define them once. You have this like kind of global ERD that exists. And then on every table, you can define metrics, and you teach DBT how to calculate those metrics. And then at query time, when somebody makes a request from the semantic layer API, metric flow, this technology that I was talking about, determines, based on your relationships, your ERD, how to write the SQL that can be executed against the database that will have the optimal query plan.
Got it. Okay, very interesting. So at this year's Coalesce, you'll be showing this new capability. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And this has really been, there's only really two things that we've heard from users since last year. It's been support more integrations and give me joins. And so we're doing both of those things.
That is great. One of the things that I want to change tracks, and I want to talk to you about this concept of data mesh. I know there's this great debate coming out, and people are putting together with you. I saw that on LinkedIn. So I'm curious about your views on data mesh, but more than data mesh, your views on data products.
I have a lot to say on data mesh. I have very little to say on data products.
Okay, no worries.
Maybe let's start about talking about data products. I think that there are a lot of people who have very well-defined thoughts on this topic. From my perspective, what people have done is define almost anything as a data product. It could be an internal dashboard. It could be, a public dashboard that is the homepage of your web app that people pay you a ton of money for. Those, from my perspective, it's not that useful to use this word data product to describe everything. From my perspective, the biggest divide here is this customer facing or is this internal facing? And I think that you generally apply a different level of rigor based on which of those audiences something's for. And DBT is primarily used for internal facing data products, but not exclusively. I think it is not uncommon for DBT to also be used inside of data products that are customer facing. When it comes to mesh, this is a topic that for me has evolved from a curiosity to something that we are investing real time and attention to internally. And it's something that shows up in basically every conversation I have with a senior data leader at this point. I think, gosh, I remember when Zhamak started talking about data mesh. It was like 2019.
Yeah, 2019.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I am very impressed at the speed with which this idea has gone from a blog post to, the ears of. No, that's not fair. And not the ears, but like the strategic plans of a huge number of data leaders.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, that's incredible, because the hardest thing to do in the enterprise, at least in my now grand total of 3 years of experience, is to actually create change. I mean, large enterprises and large data organizations are complex enough that creating any change is very challenging. And so that is happening here. And from my perspective, that's really exciting. The thing that I think is motivating so much interest and movement around this topic is that it solves a real problem for data leaders today. In a world in which your budgets were always going up and you could always hire more people, then when people asked you for new data products, you could just use your team. And, you're the chief data officer. You can just say like, okay, I'll put a team on that. But which that doesn't result in, a great amount of efficiency, but things get done. when you're in an environment where, for the first time in a long time, budgets are not going up every single year, that, headcount is not necessarily growing, you have to look, when people ask you for things, you can't just say, no, that's not happening. You have to find some way of getting creative and saying yes. And so I think mesh is wonderful because it is an ability that the centralized data leader says, okay, great. I am getting a bunch of requests. I cannot build all this stuff myself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a system whereby my centralized team can create guardrails for the rest of the organization. And now I can push this work out to closer to where it actually happened, to the areas of the business where it's being requested.
Domains. Yeah, push it to the domains.
The domains.
They know the data the most. So.
Right. But not do it in a chaotic way. Do it in a way that, like, my team retains a level of governance. Yeah. And so in our conversations with data leaders in the past 6 months, we've been very, very focused on how to create centralized governance with distributed control. Yeah. And DBT is very much evolving in a direction where this is an architecture that will be really first class. And that hasn't been true in the past. DBT has been pretty monolithic. It has encouraged centralization, and we want that to go in the other direction.
So is this a lot of change from DBTs, or is it more of a mindset shift? Because today you've got a centralized team that is using DBT to do all kinds of data transformations. Now in the decentralized world, that team or a part of that team moves into different domains who are responsible for their product. But the use of DBT should remain pretty much the same, except now you have to do governance across different domains. Would you say so?
So the way that it shows up for us is that it's a little bit like, again, I pull extensively from software engineering, but it's a little bit like building monolithic systems versus building microservices.
Correct. Yeah.
So you could have 100 engineers building an application, and they could be all working in the same language, working in the same code base. Everybody could be reviewing everybody else's pull requests. And then the way that you use each other's functionality is you either reference a function directly, or you could, even in that world, you could go directly to the database and just like read the data. What we've learned is that's a bad idea. Like, at a certain point, the complexity and disorganization of that system makes it harder and harder to scale as you add people to it, as you add functionality to it. And so what software engineers have done is they've said, okay, about the right level of organization to maintain a code base is the number of people who can eat 2 pizzas, the classic 2-pizza team.
Correct.
And so I don't know how much pizza you eat, but that's generally like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. But then all of these much smaller code bases need to be able to interact with each other, and they need to interact with each other via mature APIs. And so right now, writing DBT code generally is done in these monolithic code bases, because if you looked 4 years ago, there were no DBT users that had projects that were large enough to merit a kind of service-oriented architecture. But now it's very common to have like very large, like 5,000 plus mod transformations in a given project, and you see some of these same problems start to occur. And so it is the same. It can be the same set of humans that are writing the DBT code, or this can be an opportunity to take this centralized group, distribute them into the data domains, and then add additional people who now, because they're working in a smaller code base, and it's safer because maybe this is just an edge in the graph as opposed to like at the center. They can also now start to contribute.
One of the confusions with data mesh is that when Jean-Marc came out with a book and her whole thesis on it, there's never been a how to do it. And so different companies will have their own vision and say, put a data mesh label on it. In fact, I was surprised just a month ago, we were at Databricks Summit. I saw you at Snowflake, and then I went to Databricks Summit after that. They announced Lakehouse Federation, which they call a data mesh. Now, in a federation is data virtualization. So any thoughts like here, we're doing something totally different than what ETL does. So, but they call it data mesh too. So any thoughts on data federation virtualization?
So I don't honestly, I don't have sophisticated thoughts on the solutions that Jean-Marc's work has prescribed for the problem. I will say that I don't think that the kind of canonical data mesh solutions are necessarily built for people like me, or like the persona that DBT users typically are.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of conversations about containers and streaming and this kind of stuff. And it honestly, it's not like the types of problems that I tend to, or our users tend to be faced with. So I see data mesh as an absolutely brilliant naming of a problem and a description of a problem. And I think, honestly, that is often the hardest thing to do. And then, yes, there is going to be competition in the market to actually build working solutions to this problem that was very effectively named. And in the near future, the kind of work that we've been doing, we're going to start launching the functionality that actually enables people to do what we're calling create a DBT mesh.
Oh, wow.
But this is a very different idea than what Databricks announced.
Yes.
I think in general, the word mesh has come to mean this ability to centralize governance and distribute control.
Which is interesting because one of the data mesh principles is federated computational governance, which gets interesting. But that's the thing with data mesh. In fact, I was at MIT CDO conference last week, and coming out of that, the two hottest topics are LLMs and data products. So I think we've talked quite a bit about data mesh. So let's talk about LLMs. What is DBT's going forward? How are you looking at the role these large language models and generative AI plays in your space?
So there's a couple different. First of all, I'm very excited about it. I'm definitely in the Mark Andreessen camp of this is going to be a very, very positive change for the world when we look back on this in 1, 2, 3 decades. So in terms of how we as a company, we as a product, or the DBT community can benefit from this, I think that the first and the most obvious one is that because DBT is code first, it is kind of not that hard to get a model to generate DBT code. And that code is not going to be 100% correct every time, but it's going to be close. And it will save you a tremendous amount of time if you start with a prompt and then edit from there. So I think that's functionality that you're going to see in our users' hands, and they're not terribly distant future. Then you move on to, that's stuff that GitHub has blazed the trail on with Copilot, and we're kind of following in footsteps of other folks there. And then you get into more interesting stuff where it's how will the BI ecosystem change?
Correct.
If you, right? Like, we're used to essentially using chart builders to answer questions. But forever, like, what business users have actually wanted to do is just ask the questions and get the answers back. The semantic layer, you mentioned this before, the DBT semantic layer is in an incredible spot, because what LLMs do not and cannot and will never do is provide a deterministic answer to a question.
Correct.
They will always provide a probabilistic answer to a question. And so what you need in a BI context is you need a deterministic, well-governed answer. And so the semantic layer can provide that. And so what you, I think, need is a solution where you write a question, a prompt that asks for some business metric that gets refined by the LLM into a specific semantic layer query. And the semantic layer supplies the very specific answer to that question. And I think that is the direction that, like, many BI vendors are going, and I think we're very well positioned there.
Yeah, actually, there's a term for that: retrieval augmented generation, RAG. So that's what DBT is getting into, and that is one of the hottest places to be. So you retrieve the deterministic answer from the semantic layer, turn that into a prompt, and send it to the LLM. So
I love this.
Yeah.
Ever since you mentioned this, I'm now on the an Amazon page explaining RAG. This is great. I didn't know there was a term for this already. Yeah,
it's been, actually, Facebook introduced it in September 2020. So way before, at that time, nobody paid attention because we didn't have a chat GPT like a product that democratized AI for everybody. So now that everyone's talking about it, so these concepts are getting revived. So that's great. So we are reaching end of the time. I would love to ask you one question that I'd like to ask at the end. Tell us something about you that the world generally does not know. Something that you do. Right?
So I grew up in a pretty rural setting. Not totally in the middle of nowhere, but it was pretty remote. I had chickens, had like 12 chickens growing up, and would go out every weekend morning and collect the eggs from the chickens. This is when I'm like 6 or something, and I was always a little afraid because you had to reach under the hen that was like sitting on top of her eggs. You had to like take the eggs from her, and she would like stare you right in the face as you were doing this. And so I have many memories of my childhood doing stuff like that.
Where were you growing up? What part of the country?
Just south of the Maryland-Pennsylvania line.
I see.
Just a little north of Baltimore.
Do you go back? Like, do you have family? Oh, okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is great. Tristan, thank you so much. This has been such a remarkable conversation. I'm so glad. Thank you for making the time, and all the best for all these things that are coming up. It's we live, I like to say, in a golden era of data these days. Just so much is happening. I agree. It's happening like way too fast. So like just never slows down. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you. Likewise. Take care.
Right. Bye.